Hi, this is Estelle Erasmus, your host for Freelance Writing Direct. In this short, soundbite-filled podcast, I'll cover everything the freelance and creative writer and author needs to do to move forward with their writing, their creativity, and their career. Through conversations with guests, we'll cover tips, tricks, and actionable strategies. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes and Spotify. Welcome everybody to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and I'm a writing coach, teacher at NYU, and author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published. And I'm so thrilled to have Emily Maloney with us today. Emily is the author of Cost of Living by Holt, which is a USA Today Best Book of 2022. Her work has also appeared in Glamour, Virginia Quarterly Review, Best American Essays, and the American Journal of Nursing, among others. In addition to her work as an EMT and ER tech, she has worked as a dog groomer, pastry chef, general contractor, tile setter, and catalog model, and has sold her ceramics at art fairs. Maloney has twice been awarded a McDowell Fellowship. She lives in Evanston, Illinois. Her next book, Burn This House Down, is forthcoming in 2025. So this episode I am calling Cost of Living and Writing with Emily Maloney. So welcome to the program, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I have your book here. I've read through your book. And it's a fascinating expose into the high cost of the healthcare industry and more. And can you tell me a little bit about the genesis of your book, which again is this exploration and going into your own medical debt in a situation where, as an ER tech, you had sort of a bird's eye view of the system, as well as being a patient yourself?
Yeah, thanks. No, I didn't plan it that way. Cost of living came out of my graduate thesis. So I went to University of Pittsburgh for my MFA, and I came in with a bunch of essays about working in the ER and these different scenes, and I didn't really understand what I was really writing about ultimately. And then actually after I'd graduated, I was on assignment for VQR, Virginia Quarterly Review. And basically I was not an experienced reporter, and that may have had something to do with it. But I had pitched this piece that I was going to be writing on West Virginia EMTs, and my source disappeared. So I emailed my editor at VQR and I said, that story has gone up in smoke. Maybe you can do something with this. And so I sent him an essay from my MFA thesis that at the time had a terrible title. It was something like The Cost of Suffering or something along those lines. And, he called me and said, we can do something with this. And I thought, okay. And so he ended up, I guess, naming the book. So a lot of the essays then sort of coalesced around this topic of cost and healthcare cost and emotional cost from there. But it basically started as, oops, I lost sight of what I was doing and wasn't able to contact my source and had some issues there. Like, this piece fell apart. Would you like this other piece?
So it was a happy accident, actually.
A really happy accident, I think. I mean, I've been working on this manuscript, but it really wasn't called Cost of Living. It had, like, I think in graduate school, my graduate thesis that I submitted had a title like Amputation for the Greater Good or something horrible. And I just thought, well, whatever, I'm not good at titling things. But a lot of those essays ended up becoming Cost of Living.
And you really delve into the costs of drugs and procedures, dealing with side effects from drugs, and various tools of the ER, I guess, like Dermabond and staples, which are regularly used. And so it's very interesting because you even have a chapter that is very specific to that. It's called A Brief Inventory of My Drugs and Their Retail Price, which
Right.
were all the drugs that you had been given. So what was your research process like to get all these specific details that you were able to use in the essays?
I keep a notebook. So a lot of the time when I had a shift in the ER back in 2008 that felt like, oh my gosh, something weird happened today at work. I have to go and write all of this down. A lot of those little fragments that were originally part of just sort of like my written record of my day became essays in time. A lot of the work around sort of like the nitty gritty of generating these like specific terms. I would, if I didn't remember a term, my first drafts are often littered with TKs because I won't let myself go on the internet. And then I go back and I'm like, okay, what is this thing called? I spoke with people I had worked with. Actually, cost of living was extensively fact checked. And so I ended up sending PDFs of my medical records, of my medical bills. The fact checker also spoke with one of my coworkers who was able to verify that these things had taken place. So it was a really, at least when I was writing things for the magazine, whatever that was, those essays ended up getting fact checked. And so there was a lot of sort of like, well, the nitty gritty, right? Where does this information come from? How can I verify this information? And I don't know, I obsessively PDF everything. So like I have a really significant record of my entire life, possibly in a not particularly useful way. Like if I had a job that was not writing about these things, then like there would be no use for these materials. But I just try and take really good notes at the time. And then I'm not afraid to pick up the phone and call someone if I need to.
So you would use the phone. What about, would you use any websites or any particular tools?
There's drugs, drug retail prices listed online. I can also, call my pharmacy and get like a printout of what I had taken in, several years ago, or sometimes I would have like the receipt itself because I had PDF'd it. Sometimes I didn't know. And sometimes I'd have to say, well, I think I remember it like this, or sort of use some of those weasel words to kind of approximate. But I think that a lot of the nuts and bolts of the work either came when I originally wrote something down and then went back to it. And then to a lesser extent, for my new book right now, I'm looking a lot in tax records. I'm making FOIA requests. Like it's a very different kind of book. For cost of living, a lot of the materials I already had. A lot of it was just like, okay, when did I work here? Where's my old bank statement from 2009 or 2010? A lot of it was more self-research rather than like Googling necessarily.
So what I found fascinating about your book is that although it's a collection of essays, together, all the essays are sort of like an expose of what is actually going on in the healthcare industry from the point of view of you as a patient, from the point of view of patients, from the point of view as an ER tech.
Right.
Dealing with doctors, dealing with patients, to the point where you worked in pharma, which I actually worked in pharma for 7 years.
I didn't know that.
Yes. So it was very interesting reading your chapter where you talk about Dr. Desai and how he kind of texted you a lot before you went to an industry event. and the different descriptions of the doctors and how they are. Have you gotten any pushback or blowback from the pharma industry from some of the things you've written?
I've maybe a couple messages from people on LinkedIn that I don't know, people who, had worked in another sector or for another company who wanted to message me and tell me that I got it wrong or different or right or whatever it was. And that sort of thing, I don't necessarily feel a need to respond. I think that the medical system in the US is really broken. And having gotten the opportunity to see it both, I was a patient, misdiagnosed for years, and then to work in the ER. And then later I got my EMS, my EMT license, worked in that capacity to some degree. And then, working ultimately in the pharmaceutical industry, where I'm realizing that, like, in some ways money has no meaning, right? And we're just sort of like, there's a lot of work around sort of justifying our own existences. And at the same time, like, the people I worked with were all incredibly smart, driven, wanted to make things better for patients, wanted to make things easier for the system and for the people who operated within that system. But at the same time, like, we're still spending tens of thousands of dollars to fly to Europe to go to a conference or whatever. And I do think that we need to embark on this era of radical change if we're hoping to really see any shifts in the way that healthcare costs in this country, and what we could maybe be doing about it is something that I think is still
so
muddy.
true. It's
Still
so
muddy
true,
and
because I
problematic.
remember, I mean, I had health insurance. So when I gave birth to my daughter, I had a C-section and I was in the hospital for 5 days, and my insurance covered most of it, but I got the bill, and I mean, it was excessive. It was past $50,000. It was way past that. And I was just thinking, how could anyone really deal with something like that, especially if they didn't have insurance or didn't have a good insurance? And getting back to pharma, I worked on both sides. So continuing medical education, which is very specific, that you can't, like, fly your physician first class to
Right. I worked in CME before I actually ended up in my, like, medical publications job. So I definitely, like, the CME stuff is so regulated, right?
Yes.
There's so many rules about how you can talk about and compensate physicians that are added on to the general rules that are out there, right? From the Sunshine Act.
And then I've worked on the promotional side also, and that's a little bit different.
Sure.
So that has a lot more leeway, but I think they have been very regulated. So at least that one aspect of the field is a little bit under control. But you talk about a therapist, and you were misdiagnosed. Do you want to say what you were?
Yeah. So I attempted suicide when I was 19 and was hospitalized, and I was really depressed, and was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It turns out that probably I just had a vitamin deficiency and hypothyroidism. And I was a depressed college student in the way that a lot of college students are depressed. So that was sort of my entry into this world.
And then you had a psychiatrist who kept prescribing you medication after medication. And you even talk about stalking her a little bit just to find out more information because you were fascinated by her. But what do you think her impetus was to keep prescribing the medications to you?
Yeah, I call her Julie in the book. I think we're all just sort of operating with the information we have. And I also, in addition to hypothyroidism and some other issues, I also have nonverbal learning disability. I wasn't diagnosed with that, not very clear. There are, like, motor components. I'm incredibly clumsy. So there's different elements to my sort of neurologic, like my developmental disability, basically, right? And I don't know if she was aware of that, right, at the time, because I wasn't diagnosed until much later. So the way that I presented to her certainly indicated to her that I was in need of help. And I kept going, and I kept, I wanted to be a good patient, right? It can be challenging to navigate that landscape.
Let me ask you this. I know that pharma tries to get doctors interested in prescribing their drugs.
Absolutely.
And they have dinners, often they have lunches, often they have non-CME regulated activities.
Well, I mean, we have the Sunshine Act now. There are rules around reporting sort of transfer of value activities, that physicians might get a free lunch from a pharma company, but they have to disclose that. Sometimes if they work for like a healthcare system that is a university healthcare system, then they may be subject to additional regulations and restrictions. But if they're in private practice, the restrictions may not be as stringent.
I want to get back to the book and the structure of the book. So
Sure.
It's in essays. I know that a lot of our listeners and viewers are struggling with their own way of structuring their memoir or their essays, or how they want to do their nonfiction project.
Sure. The way that Cost of Living came about was I wrote a book proposal, and it included some of the essays, including Cost of Living, which had by then been picked up by Best American Essay. So that was like a huge get, right? And then I had other essays that were under contract. And once it was purchased, there were a few people who I spoke with, editors, during these phone calls, where it's lovely. It's like you get to be courted, right? But I spoke with a number of editors who said something like, well, we would really like more of a memoir, like continuous. And I'm like, I don't know how to make that happen. So your guess is as good as mine, but like maybe like this isn't the book for you. A number of people did end up ultimately bidding on it, and it sold. And my editor at the time, he suggested I try and revise it into a memoir. And I tried to do that, and it didn't really work. And then I revised it back into an essay collection, and then suddenly it worked, because I had added additional essays that I had previously sort of tucked aside that I didn't think necessarily worked. I think the important thing for me in writing an essay collection is that I need to have that space to take the 30,000-foot view, that as an essayist, you can sort of move in and out of space really easily. Memoir is like, it's supposed to be a continuous dream. And so you have to have that like really close perspective. And having that close, sustained perspective, given that this happens over so many years, was really tricky for me. And also just the fact that I couldn't pull back and talk about the larger systemic issues that I thought were very much a part of the book. So that's why I had to revise it back into an essay collection. And then suddenly something clicked, and then we were able to get it out the door.
One of the things that I noticed is that when you write about patients, particularly in the chapter about pain, which is such an endemic situation in American culture, that you use so much detail and description. What was your process behind that? Did you want the reader to really feel what the patient was feeling? How was that decided?
Yeah. I think there's several essays that sort of deal with pain in various capacities, right? But in the essays that take place where there's a lot of detail, in some of those cases, I interviewed people again and again to get that additional information, or I met with them years later, I met with them. So there's a few sections where there's like maybe additional detail because of those meetings that I had. And in those situations, I just would go home and write everything immediately, or I'd sit in my car after meeting with them and just write by hand. And so a lot of that came out of those kinds of interactions where I was like, okay, I need to speak to this person again. In terms of some of the other pieces, like I think for me, the detail comes, it's hard for me to provide like specifics as to where the details necessarily come from, because I feel like I've just got like a narrator and she just sort of talks and I just write down what she says. Like, she'll be like, look at all these things. Here's how she's moving. Here's how she's dressed. Here's like the space that she occupies. Something that I found it really helpful there's a book called Field Working, and it's a textbook. Bonnie Sunstein is one of the two authors. She was one of my professors in college, and she taught a class where there's all these exercises in the book, and it's just like, draw the space, make a list of these things, name this object that's in this space or this memory or whatever. And so for people who have more difficulty getting those details, I found it really helpful.
So do you have some writing tips? Because now you've gone through this book and you have another book.
I do.
You're contracted for, and you could talk a little bit about that. But if you can also share some writing tips for people who are working on their works in progress.
Yeah, I think everyone just needs to do what they can. Sometimes folks have rules about, like you should do this, or you should write for this many words, or you should write for this amount of time, or you should have a special space. Like ideally, yes, like find a desk, set up something. My desk is currently on clearance at IKEA. It's $29. So if you need a desk, get a desk. But I think that sometimes folks get caught up in the structure or in the work around, like, how do I make a writing life, when they really just need to be the writing. If you write on your phone, great. If you don't write on your phone, great. If you write by hand, fantastic. Like, it literally doesn't matter how you do it, just that you do it. And I think also it's really important to have a community more than anything, because the work of publishing a book and the emotional crap around that can be really, really stressful and debilitating, even if it goes well. And I think it's really important to have like a supportive group of folks, whether they are other writers who understand what you're going through, or they're not writers, but they're willing to listen to you, kvetch and complain.
How did you find your group? Was it through your MFA program or some other?
Surprisingly not. There are folks that I've kept in touch with, although not generally in my genre, which is kind of interesting. I found a lot of community in Facebook, honestly, like lately on Twitter. I feel like being on Twitter can be really helpful, even though like we're in the dark days or whatever, and it's like the end of Twitter. Just if you continue tweeting, eventually you'll find other people. I think also, it can be helpful to take a class. I know I've taught classes where sometimes folks get together afterwards and continue to swap work and just have that accountability. The other thing is, once you are in the point where you like have an agent or something along those lines, I've really connected with a lot of my like agent siblings, people who are also represented by the same person. And we sort of have a similar aesthetic or a similar sort of philosophy around sentences and their importance or whatever it is. I think that can be really helpful. I also, for a while, I did a thing where I just let people know locally that I was going to be writing for a certain amount of hours at this coffee shop. Like, please come, don't make eye contact, just sit down and work.
I love that.
And so we did that. That came out of my time as a grad student. My professor was teaching a class, and we, in addition to our workshop, which was once a week, we all lived sort of in the same neighborhood or adjacent, and we would all just show up at the same coffee shop when it opened and get coffee or tea or whatever and sit down and work until we had to go teach or take a class or go to our other job or whatever it was. And it was really helpful because we didn't actually share any of that work with each other. It was just sort of a body present, sitting in the chair, making the work happen. It was incredibly useful. I found it really helpful during the pandemic. I have friends who are not local, and we body double on Zoom. So we'll like say, hey, hi, I'm working on XYZ for the next hour. And then we just mute ourselves, keep our cameras on, and work.
I like that.
It's really, really helpful. I really endorse that, especially if you don't have a lot of time, or if you're not in an area of the country that has a lot of writers where you could meet people in person, or if you're immunocompromised, it makes it a lot easier to sort of hang out with folks over the internet.
So we only have a little bit of time left, and I just wanted to ask you about your next book and what that's about, if you can speak about it.
Yeah, so it's called Burn This House Down. And in 2018, my brother burned my parents' house to the ground and was booked for felony arson. He has no remorse. He was later diagnosed with something called antisocial personality disorder, which is what the clinical term for psychopaths or sociopaths. And I'm writing about that. It's a book about my family. It's a book about grief. It's a book about what happens when the people you live with and grew up with turn out to be different, or maybe you turn out to be different than anyone expected, and sort of how to manage one's anger. Like, I'm just really angry and sad, and I would like readers to also be angry and sad and ultimately redeemed by the experience of reading the book. So I do feel like it's pretty dark, but it does come out in 2025, and I'm learning ultimately, eventually, to talk about it. It's hard to talk about because I'm sort of in the depths of writing it right now. It's due in January.
Wow.
To my editor. So I'm really sort of in the thick of it. And the experience of selling the book was really weird in that my agent called me a few weeks before Cost of Living was supposed to come out and said, "Hey, they made an offer on your new book." When he actually said, "Hey, your editor called," and I thought, "Oh no, what have I done?" I was so panicked. I thought, "Oh gosh, I've done something terribly wrong."
My gosh.
I've offended someone on Twitter, or I've caused some interpersonal problem. I thought, but as it turned out, they made an offer on my new book, whatever that would be. And so I sort of typed up a little paragraph of what I thought the new book was that I'd been working on and sent it over. And then my agent and editor negotiated, and now I have a new book due.
Congratulations. Where can people find you on social media? You said you're on Twitter a lot.
I'm on Twitter. I'm less on Facebook these days. And I have a website, emilymaloney.net. I lost the .com to the other Emily Maloney, who's also a writer.
My goodness.
There's three of us. Like my dream
That's
is
a
someday
story.
we'll go to a writing conference, and the title of the panel will just be "My name is Emily Maloney."
What's your handle on Twitter? And I'll put everything in the show
Emily
notes.
F. Maloney.
Okay.
I'm on Instagram too, but I constantly forget I have an Instagram. So
okay, so
mostly ceramics are on Instagram.
Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing everything about the genesis of your book, your journey writing it, a little bit more about how you structured it, and your experience in all the different aspects of the healthcare industry, which put it all together for you, plus your own experience. So we're looking forward to your next book. You'll have to come on the program for your next book, and we'll stay connected. Thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website, and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.